Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Roleplay Chat. I'm Matt, a game master who can't stop talking about role-playing games. I hope everybody had a fantastic summer. I know I enjoyed my summer break, got to spend a lot of time with family and friends and the kids, and spend a lot of time outside. So I hope it was the same for yourselves. I'm also super excited to get right back into Roleplay Chat. We have some awesome conversations lined up for you. I also have some really awesome content already recorded that I just kind of have to, spend some time editing and cleaning up and getting ready for all of you all. So yeah, it's going to be a really awesome second half of the season, starting with today's episode. Today's episode features Diana of the Rose, and we talk about death saves in your Dungeons & Dragons game. Now, it's a really neat conversation that covers not only our experiences with death, player character death and death saves in Dungeons & Dragons, but we also explore other game systems and how they handle death and death rules. And then we also cover some interesting altered, sorry, I had a hard time coming out, altered rules and alterations that people have kind of customized for their Dungeons & Dragons game. So we're going to kind of list them off and talk about them and how we feel like they would impact the game. So it might give you some interesting ideas. Also coming back for the second half of the season is the Indie Showcase segment. So kind of at the halfway mark, we're going to be talking about Galatia today. Galatia is an indie created solo tabletop role-playing game. It's like a journaling game where you get to play as a creation of some kind. So a statue or a masterpiece or something of that nature that has been created with the intention of being perfect, and you kind of have to live up to that expectation. So it's an interesting introspective game. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to hear from its creator, and we're also going to do a quick review of Galatia. So yeah, with that, without further ado, let's dive right into the conversation, and welcome back once again. Cheers now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Roleplay Chat. I'm Matt, a game master who can't stop talking about role-playing games. Today on Roleplay Chat, we're going to be exploring death rules and death saves in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Rules as written, death saves I find pretty boring, actually. So I'm really excited to be talking about it today. I know that in the D&D discourse wheel of like the wheel of time of discourse, death in games always comes up, and I actually don't think I've ever talked about it. So I figured that, now would be a good time to do so. And joining me is a Twitch partner, actual play performer, tabletop RPG influencer, a game master, storyteller, and all-around tabletop RPG nerd. Please join me in welcoming Diana Faye, aka Diana of the Rose, to our interview today. Diana, welcome to Roleplay Chat.
Hi. Oh, I'm so stoked to be here, especially for the death episode. There's so much that can go into it. I'm ready. I have so many notes. I'm so prepared.
Let's do it. Yeah, let's dig right in. But before we do that, I do want to give you the opportunity to say hello, give a little bit of context to people listening, kind of what kind of things do you like in role-playing games? And also just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your channels and the shows that you're in to kind of give us a sense of, where your advice is coming from as we talk about death today.
Yeah, happy to. So, as mentioned before, my name is Diana of the Rose on all platforms. You can primarily find me on TikTok. It's where I've been historically. I was most famous for holding up a massive DM screen one time, and from there it snowballed into me giving people D&D advice. It is pretty D&D heavy, but it can be generalized to game mastering for all sorts of games and all sorts of systems. And lately that's been spreading over into Instagram and then to YouTube. And then I also host a Twitch stream 3 times a week where I answer people's questions on the fly as they come, and then also do whatever else I want. That Twitch stream is really, like, I call myself a D&D content creator, but I've done like some weird stuff on that stream. And then of course you can see me wandering around, conventions. So all of the PAXs, Gen Con, of course, the big one. And
Nice.
over there, I do a lot of panels as well, doing the exact same thing, teaching people how to play and occasionally popping in for one-shots on different people's channels, live in front of studio audiences, things like that. It's been super exciting. Everyone is so nice in this community, and it's exciting to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I saw that you were going to be in on the main stage at Gen Con. for
I
something.
am.
That's
Yeah.
super exciting. That's
Which
super
by the
what
time this goes up will probably be in the past. So, yeah,
yeah,
it went
exactly.
so well. It went super well. Uh, manifesting.
That's it. 100%. The stadium was full. Everyone was watching, cheering, I'm sure. Um, yeah, that's great. No, and I couldn't agree more. This community is fantastic. I had the pleasure of going. PAX Unplugged is my favorite one of the conventions.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of going to that a couple years ago and had an absolute blast. I'm hoping I can convince the powers that be for me to go down to Philly again this winter.
Stoked.
It's a
It's in
long
December,
drive.
right?
Yeah, it's like the beginning of December, I think.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, the first weekend of December. Have you been to that one?
I have. So one thing I love about PAX is they're really nice to creators. So I didn't even
Mhm.
know PAX Unplugged existed, much less that they would give me a free creator badge and things like that, plus a
Nice.
plus one badge. And I think I did a giveaway for that one as well. They were so nice. I love the PAX team. Shout out to the enforcers and everyone on there. They're so cool. But yeah, I think at Unplugged I did a panel on how to be a better GM. And it actually, we ran out of seats. We had to cut off the line because that panel was so
Wow.
popular. And we ran out of time and ended up shepherding everyone into the hallway so that we could continue answering their questions there because we felt bad just leaving. There were so many people waiting to ask
Oh
things.
no. Well, that's great. It makes me so happy to hear that there's more people that want a game master. I think there's like a
Yeah.
shortage of game masters in the
There is.
TTRPG space, like 100%.
Yeah, that's my main mission here is to try and get people to not be afraid of it. It's a lot easier than y'all think. If you look at something like Critical Role, the bar seems really high, but if you break it down into like really easy narrative steps that you can take to kind of level up your game, I promise it's not scary.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. And hopefully today we can demystify and simplify a couple of things that have to do with death in the game, which is probably the scariest thing, or one of the scariest things, I think, for players and game masters alike.
Mhm.
So I'm hoping we can kind of cover three main topics of conversation. We'll see if we get through all of it. The first being just our experiences with characters dying in D&D, kind of rules as written, how that makes us feel when we play and when we game master. Then I like to talk about just kind of how other games that we've played kind of handle death and the rules there and how that works out, and maybe we can draw some comparisons. And then the last thing is I'd like to talk about some variations and modifications that I've tried, I've seen some people talk about online, and just kind of ping pong it back and forth and see how you feel about some of those rules, how I feel about some of those rules, and maybe if we have any kind of strategies to implement them. Uh, Sound good?
Perfect.
Cool. Now for some legalese. Very quickly, I want to throw in a caveat because I know people are going to get maybe a little bit upset when we talk about death in tabletop role playing games. And the caveat is that death in role playing games is dependent on what you want and what your table wants. So if you want to have death at your table be super hardcore and super punishing, and everybody at your table subscribes to that, I'm happy for you. If you don't want that and you want the opposite, and everybody wants something more lighthearted and you don't want your characters to die ever, and again, everybody subscribes to that, I'm happy for you too. We're not here to talk about, whether or not things should or shouldn't be difficult, but rather the impact that the rules have on kind of achieving that, if that makes sense. So I really want to talk about how that makes us feel, how our tables felt when characters died, that kind of stuff, and then suggest maybe some ways for people to consider modifying those rules, if that makes any kind of sense.
Oh yeah. I always tell people that like when you go into a video game, options menu and you change the difficulty from like, adventure mode to easy, medium, hard,
Mm,
hardcore, things like that. Adjusting death save rules in D&D is the equivalent of that. Like the impact that it has is monumental. So it's we're going to give you some options for that.
yeah, definitely. And I don't want to hear any people come out here saying that like Elden Ring doesn't have a difficulty setting
Oh my
because
God.
we're not, that's a conversation that'll never end. Um, they really should have pause menus, in my opinion. That drives me crazy. But
Yeah, there
maybe
was a thing where, like, wasn't there some, parent, like a single parent out there who was like, "Hey, I really wish they would add pause menus to the game because, like, I really wanna play, but I need to be able to step away to take care of my kids," and things like that. Oh, man, I don't know. Those sorts of adjustments would be I feel like it's common sense, but I'm not a video game dev. I'm just a woman with a microphone.
yeah, yeah, I know. We're not experts in that kind of stuff. But making things accessible should never really be something that is like controversial. But anyway. All right, let's talk about our experiences with death in D&D. And maybe kind of the first question I have for you, Diana, is have you ever killed a player character before?
It Yes and no.
Okay.
I got really close. So we were encountering, for those who have played Curse of Strahd, the very first dungeon is a level 1 through 3, kind of like intro module. It can be done as a one shot,
Hmm.
and it's a horror themed kind of mini module. And the very end boss of that particular dungeon, I had swapped out for something a little bit more scary. Hits hard, hits fast, had
Nice.
like a 60-foot fly speed, things like that, and so it was darting around the battlefield, taking people out with multi-attack hits. And within the first couple rounds, I ended up downing the fighter character. Um, I panicked. I did not, because I could see
Yeah.
my player, not the character, but the player was having like a moment of, oh God, we're level 3. This should not happen this quick. And I was across the table from them, like, oh God, they're level 3. This should not happen this quick. And realistically, like, I'm a realistic DM. They knew the risks. I told them that death was a possibility, checked in with them and all that standard stuff. But at the same time, when a player goes down, it's scary for both sides.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. It is scary. It's happened. I haven't really killed any. I mean, I've killed a few players, not players, characters, not the player. I've killed a few
I mean,
characters,
when they get really
but
yeah.
when they really start going murder hobo, they have no choice, right?
Yeah.
But it's never been like a high level character. I feel like D&D's first 3 levels are so fragile that that's usually where it happens.
Mhm.
And the closest I came recently for players in my home game, you can skip ahead maybe 10 minutes if you don't wanna know this. Listen in if you want some of the, like, man behind the curtain revealed, but there was a moment when one of the fighter, again, kinda like in your situation, faced off 1v1 against a hag, and the
Oof.
rest of the party was otherwise occupied with other stuff, and she was already really injured. So when the hag, you know, got up close and personal and did like I think they have 2 attacks, right? So downed the fighter. The fighter was on the ground. The hag was upset, so was gonna keep attacking this person. Like there wasn't this kind of scenario like, oh, you're unconscious, the enemy's gonna leave you alone, you know?
Yeah.
So I had to I saw the fear in my player's eyes and the rest of the table, and I had to kind of do like you said. I had to pull some punches, and I proposed an alternative where the hag, who hags like to make deals, came up with the deal and proposed a deal to say, I'm not going to kill this character if somebody owes me a favor and lets me look through their eyes at any point in your life. Like the hag is going to find a way to like see through what you see, and they debated for a long time and accepted it, but that's beyond
Man.
the story's behind the point. Besides the point, um, yeah, death can be scary. Death can be really scary to players.
It is, but you touched on a really good point where if you offer them an ex machina, especially at early levels, it's an amazing RP opportunity. It's a really good plot point, and also it
Hmm.
provides an opportunity in some cases to even, segue into a multi-class. I've had players come up to me, and I always ask them to tell me their plans when it comes to leveling and things like that. Like if they want to take a level in Warlock or in Cleric or whatever, I'm have them let me know ahead of time, and then I'm like, okay, I'm gonna give you a narrative opportunity for that. A death save or a near death experience is a very good opportunity for you to kind of like shoehorn in a, hey, I'll save you if you make this deal for me, or hey, I'll save you, but you owe me from now on and I get to collect at a random point in time. It's a
Hmm.
very good narrative element that I feel like DMs don't often see is has that potential because and we kind of touched on it before the DM like DMG rules for death saving throws and the PHB rules for death saving throws, it's maybe a couple paragraphs. but to the
Totally.
player character, it's the end of their life. You know, like should be a lot more opportunity for narrative, yeah, these really hard hitting narrative story points, and there's just no guidance
Definitely.
for that, and so that's what
Yeah.
we're here for.
Yeah, totally, totally. And actually, Diana, you reminded me that maybe we should like remind people what the death saving throw rules are. I mean, I'm assuming that everybody knows, but real quick, we're just gonna go. I'm just gonna go through. I have a couple little lines here that I wrote down. So I don't know if you want to take a stab at it, if you remember them off the top of your head, or if
Oh
you maybe
man.
do you want me to put you on the spot and then I can like fill in with what the notes say, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, I'll just look questioningly at the camera so that way the audience won't know. And then if I stumble, you just come in and save me and edit it to make me look
Perfect.
really good. Um, so here's the thing about me being a dungeon master, and what I tell everyone else is like, you don't need to have the rules memorized. I exemplify this when it
Exactly.
comes to the death saving throw rules. I don't know them very well, but if I remember correctly, essentially, when you go unconscious, you are incapacitated and at 0 hit points.
Hmm.
If you get hit with any attack, you lose one of those death saving throws, and you have 3 total that you can lose and 3 that you can like win. If it's a melee attack, since you're incapacitated, it's an automatic crit, and any critical means you lose 2 death saving throws. If you basically on your turn from then on out, you forego your entire turn, and so you just roll a straight d20. No modifiers unless you have some ability or item that lets you modify it, or you bribe your DM and Venmo them $100 while no one's looking. Either way, if you roll a 10 or above, you succeed. If you roll a 9 or below, you count it as a failure. And so you're going to keep track of how many failures and how many successes you have. As soon as you hit 3 successes, you are stable. You're still at 0 hit points, you're still incapacitated, but you're not actively dying. So, that's a positive. But if you have 3 failures, then you die. And that's when the clock starts ticking for something like Revivify. That being said, if you roll a natural 20, fun thing happens. You just pop right back up like nothing happened. You just like full on 90 degrees sit up like Frankenstein, and you're back to 1 hit point, and you can continue on as normal, drink a potion, get back on your feet, walk it off a little bit. And did I miss anything that
No, I
seems
think that's it. Good job. I
oh
didn't need to say
amazing?
anything. Well done. Well done.
Thank God.
Yeah, that's all there is. The only other way for a character to die, which I didn't ask you to explain this, but you can also suffer instant death. Apparently, if you take so much damage that after you get to 0, you would take as much damage as you have HP, but into the negatives. That's never happened to me ever.
Mm-mm.
Maybe if you fall off like a cliff, that like all that fall
Yeah.
damage would make you instantly die, I guess. But if you're putting your players in situations where they're fighting monsters that can deal that much damage to them,
It better be scripted. There better be an
yeah.
ex machina there. There better be a good reason for it, which is not to say you shouldn't do it. I think scripted deaths are actually a really underused tool. Like, we have them all the time in video games. They serve a story purpose. I feel like
Hmm.
dungeon masters, once every couple of campaigns, not very often, should maybe throw in the occasional thing where it's like, oh God, this is a life or death scenario we cannot escape from. But on the other end of it, there's a purpose for it. Um,
Yeah,
could be
yeah,
a really good story
exactly.
beat.
Exactly. Um, cool. So I think that covers most of the ground zero, ground one stuff as it pertains to death and our experiences with death in D&D. Before we move on, though, I did kind of want to get a sense, Diana, of just how do you feel about death in D&D, and how do you feel about the death save rules? Like, do you like them? Have you made your own homebrew modifications? That kind of stuff.
I like them as written. I feel like the player handbook goes, it definitely could provide more guidance when it comes to the narrative side of things,
Hmm.
especially as D&D players are coming into the game for the first time, coming off the back of Critical Role and other APs. They want hard-hitting narrative moments, and I hope that the 2024 Player's Handbook, which should be out by the time that this releases, I believe, kind of provides more narrative
Yeah,
guidance on that front.
it's early September, I think that comes out, right?
Um,
Mid-September, maybe something like that.
Something like that? Yeah. I should know this. I'm like, I have a copy, I should have it. But something like that would be I do wish that that was changed, but as far as the actual mechanics go, I'm not much of a mechanics girly, honestly. I like it how it is. I know that's a hot take, but I haven't actually
Okay.
adjusted, except for the one thing. The one thing I have adjusted, which has been a very popular change that is almost universally adopted, is the fact that the player must roll their death saving throw in a private chat or behind my DM screen with me, and no one else gets to see it.
Okay, that's
Um,
cool.
I know you've heard this before. Do you want to explain
Yeah.
why that's a good rule?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it depends, right? It's definitely gonna add tension. It's definitely gonna enable the people around the table to try to start reading into nonverbal cues and maybe role play and stuff like that to kind of get a sense of what's going on. But I think ultimately the benefit to doing something like that, in my opinion, is that it kind of puts the focus back on the character and on the tension and not on us rolling dice. It really takes you out of the moment if you're just all staring at a die. So that's my opinion on that. I've never done blind rolls before like that, but
Really?
yeah, yeah.
I
What?
think on the avoiding metagaming front, it's pretty sick. I mean, especially because, like, you're in the middle of battle, the warlock goes down, and then they start rolling all successes, and there's no
Mhm.
enemies within 70 feet of them. Then everyone else just kind of is like, oh, Jerry's fine. He'll get up in a couple rounds. He's good.
Yeah,
Which is unrealistic. When you're actually in battle, you're gonna take a look at your friend who's bleeding out 70 feet away, and you're gonna be like, oh God, we need to help them. And so that not knowing is exactly what you said. The tension is just, oh, it's amazing. It's what I live for.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I want to kind of echo what you're saying about not being too mechanics focused because I am not a mechanically focused dungeon master at all. I much prefer the narrative. But in this particular instance, the reason why I personally dislike the death saves is that I feel like they take away from the game, right? You've got
Oh.
this epic moment, you're fighting up against something cool, your character falls to 0 hit points, and now it could potentially take you like 6 turns to die. I feel like it really takes away from that feeling of grandioseness. Is that a word? I don't know. It takes away from that feeling of like you're doing something super cool, you're fighting a super cool monster. Oh, but now you're off in the corner bleeding out and might die in 6 turns. Like it flips the switch and the narrative becomes kind of hard to like fill in the blanks of what goes on for all that time. So I definitely am excited to see how some of these other options kind of come into play. Yeah, so let's move on then. And now that we know how D&D works and how death in D&D works and death saves work, I kind of wanted to look at some other systems, maybe for inspiration or maybe for things to avoid. But I'd love to know, Diana, if you're familiar with the death rules for other games that you've played and kind of how that compares to D&D.
So this is where people really start to call me out on the fact that I call myself a TTRPG creator and not a D&D creator because I really don't know that many other systems that well. I have played one game it doesn't involve dice at all. I consider it one of the easiest tabletop role-playing games to get into. It's something that you can kind of pull the family into a little bit when they're trying to, baby's first role-playing game, which is Dread. And this is a horror game, so it's not suited for everyone depending on how you run it. It could be extremely mature, extremely gory, go into a lot of heavy topics. Other times you can modify it for children. It's up to the game master as usual. But essentially, for those who are unfamiliar, it's this game where you don't have any dice. Instead, to do any sort of skill check, you have to pull blocks from a Jenga tower. And the difficulty of what you're trying to achieve determines how many blocks that you pull. Now, if you is the Jenga tower is standard, the standard 3x3 thing. Obviously, the further into the story you go and the more difficult things you need to accomplish, the more difficult it gets to play Jenga, right? And if the tower goes down while you're trying to accomplish something, the tower falls, your character dies. It happens in that scenario. You might get a couple extra words out, a couple extra sentences, but by the end of that scene, you will die. And it is a permadeath game, as far as I'm aware, at least the version that I played. Um, However, there is a mechanic where you can do a sort of self-sacrifice
Mm.
where as you're trying to pull blocks out of the tower. So let's say the scenario I had is I was a safe cracker and I was trying to open a safe that had the MacGuffin inside. This was like the final goal of our scenario. And I had to pull like 4 blocks from an already extremely precarious tower to get this done. And there was an option where I could risk pulling the blocks and then having the tower fall and then die and then no one would be able to get into the safe. Or I could knock the tower over myself, full on just like push it over by hand. And if I did, my character would die, but I would still accomplish the skill check. And so I would
That's so
sacrifice
cool.
myself. Yeah, and it was so much fun. Definitely suited for one shots, but something like a self-sacrifice mechanic, I feel like is something that more games, especially in the horror genre, could implement. I would have trouble adapting it to D&D because D&D is a lot crunchier than a game like Dread. But that's the only one I'm familiar with.
Yeah, that's super cool. I've never played Dread, so I'm really glad you brought that up. And I think Dread is a fantastic example, actually, of death in role playing games because I think when you play a game of Dread, there's at least one character going down in that one shot, right? Like at least.
Hopefully.
But I think that's I like that you bring that example forward also because it's kind of like one end of the spectrum on death in role playing games. You have
Yeah,
D&D,
bad
which
cop.
I think is kind of in the middle, right? Like it's not a very deadly game by any means, but death exists, it's a possibility, and characters can go down if they don't think about what they're doing. Uh, Dread sounds like you're probably going down at one point or another. You might even choose to go down in a Blades of Glory, which is cool. Um, but then there's other games on the other end of the spectrum that don't have death in the rules at all. Uh, I was reading up the rules for the Tales in the Loop tabletop role playing game just before we started talking, Diana. And Tales from the Loop is a really cool universe that I wanted to run a game in for a long time now, and I didn't realize there were rules. But Free League has a really, really cool system there. And basically, the way death works, or not death, the way punishment works in that game is that when you fail certain checks, you get imposed a condition on your character. And that condition can be one of four things. I think it's like tired, confused, dazed. You know what? It doesn't really matter what they are, but there's four of these conditions. And when you get one, all of your skill checks moving forward suffer a penalty. I think it's
Hmm.
-1 penalty. The next time you screw something up, you have to pick one of the remaining three. Now you have a permanent -2 on everything. -3, -4, and then once you suffer the fifth consequence, your character becomes what they call broken. And you will always fail any challenge that you try to overcome
Oh,
unless you seek help and you go to like quote unquote heal. And I think that that's really interesting. It's an interesting way to look at removing a character from the action because your character isn't going to die, but you're going to like progressively become worse and worse to the point where you go into like this downward spiral where like you kind of need to remove yourself from the problem at hand if you want your team to succeed at overcoming it. Um, so yeah,
wild. I love that, especially because there's such good roleplay opportunities for you having to portray your character in this slow decline and their eventual path, forced retirement almost, and then the rest of the
yeah,
party having to deal with it. Like, what are their reactions going to be? Are they going to try and help? Are they going to be like, oh my God, this person is just dead weight? That has such good implications. I love that.
it's really really cool. And again, like I'm not a big mechanics person, but for the mechanics to have such a narrative impact, I can appreciate.
Yeah.
So that's really the other end of the spectrum. So I think looking at these two things from making death almost mandatory to making it excluded from the game scenario can make us consider death in a different way because death ultimately I think in D&D is like this punishment, right? It's this punishment for doing something wrong. Maybe I should think about that a little longer. But how does that what do you think? What kind
As
of
written.
role do you think death has in D&D?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of how it's designed. Is like, hey, you messed up and it's gonna get real bad real
Mhm.
fast if you don't get out of this situation. And that's where like the narrative parts of it really need to step in and shine. And that's where it's on us as GMs to kind of teach ourselves how to tweak those moments and make them more impactful. Because as it stands right now, it's just like, oh, now I just roll a d20 and hope for the best. And it's like, well, that
Yeah.
could have some more meaning.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And when we look at these other games too, it makes me think a little bit about like the tone of those games. You talked about Dread being like very horror focused.
Yep.
I
It's
don't
one of
think
those
it's
books that has a lot of warnings at the front.
Yeah, seriously. Um, it makes me wonder how the tone of the game you're playing affects the role death plays in the game, and how we as players might feel about death in the game. What kind of impact do you feel like tone has on kind of the prevalence of death in a role playing game?
Oh, they're directly linked in a way that's almost inseparable, you could take any sort of genre of game
Mm,
and instantly you're gonna have a feel for what the death mechanics should look like. Something like horror, yeah, it tends to be more realistic. You can tweak it so it's not, but like if you want to go for realism and a sense of dread, not to, not sponsored or anything by Dread, by the way. We
yeah.
just it's just it's a cool word, it's a cool game. That tension, if you want to elevate that, the death saves or the death mechanics are a really easy way to do that. Same with dark fantasy. Dark fantasy tends to have a lot of real world concepts. You're not just playing around in some Feywild type, place with dragons and fairies. It's like there are diseases running amok. There's curses. There's like local legends, horrifying things that lurk in the darkness. And so that could also be one of those like kind of hardcore death scenarios. On the other hand, you have really lighthearted games. Political games are not going to really death is going to be, if present, stretched out over a long period of time. And the mechanics are going to be slowed down because the process of someone important dying is going to have political ramifications. And so there's going to be opportunities for someone to kind of pull the strings there. Same with
Mhm.
like a high fantasy, very jovial sort of game where it's like, oh, we're at a wizarding school, we're high schoolers, death might not even be an option. So it's really inseparably tied to the theme and the tone of your game. I don't see a way in which it's not.
Yeah, yeah, that's I really like that answer. And it makes me think back a little bit to like when we're playing D&D, we're supposed to be playing this like hero's journey, right? That's kind of like the default setting, default genre for what D&D is. Of course,
Mhm.
there's lots of different like themes and skins that people can apply to it. But when you think of D&D as like the hero's journey, it makes it realistic to see that death, while it exists, is kind of hard to achieve in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, at least
Yeah.
permadeath anyway.
Oh yeah. There's so many ways to
Yeah.
revive someone. Some say too many.
Yeah. How do you feel about like resurrection spells and like all
Oh
that kind of
man.
wish spells and things like that that bring people back?
This is gonna be another hot take. I know it's very popular for people to kind of model after what CR has done, for example. I'm gonna keep coming back to Critical Role because that's the only AP I've had time to watch. Don't hate me. I haven't seen Dimension 20. I know it's on my list. Um, where Critical Role has gone in and made it so that they've implemented skill checks and skill challenges into Resurrection and Revivify and things like that, where you have to basically jump through all these hoops in order to make that happen. For me, I feel like I'm not a I'm not incredibly well educated on the balance of the game. I'm not a mechanics girly, but I feel like if as written in 5e, you can cast Revivify and it just costs the spell components and that's it, and that's how it was intended to be. I feel like that's fine. I might, however, add in some sort of narrative costs. So instead of
Mhm.
having like a skill challenge where everyone who's on the alive side of things has to do all these, begging a god for forgiveness or coaxing the spirit back into the body, I might take the person who's dead and then walk them through, even one on one. I might even pull them into a separate room and walk them through what they're seeing in the afterlife and have them have this narrative moment. Maybe you have a moment of reckoning with your warlock patron, or you speak with your god, or you see someone who has passed on to their side already who's like a family member who you miss. And I try and give them at least one reason, especially at higher levels, that the soul wouldn't be willing to return to the body. And then I let it be the player's choice from there. So I
Mhm.
don't make the people doing the revivifying do anything crazy, but instead I give the player a reason to maybe not come back. Just
I
to mess with
absolutely
them.
love that. I think that's so cool. And I mean, I haven't read the spell script or whatever it is for Revivify in a long time, but I'm pretty sure it says something like a willing target,
Yeah,
right?
you can't bring
So
someone back against their will.
if you do that kind of thing, you give them this choice, you give them this like non-trivial decision to make whether or not they're coming back because there is going to be a narrative cost. It like gives like gravitas to that decision, right? It's not just like, well, do I want my character to be dead or do I want my character to be alive? Like, no, it's more than that. it's
Yeah.
it's coming with some baggage. So I really, really like that decision. That's super cool that you do that. Um,
100%. And then above the table, it also takes up a little bit of time because, it's a little unsatisfying when a character dies. And then as soon as combat ends, everyone's like, all right, guys, pick up the diamond, let's go. And then 3 seconds later, they're alive. I feel like it should be drawn out a little bit for emphasis. So that kind of helps with that.
yeah, and I mean, I feel like in a scenario where a character is going down and they're dying, there should be enough going on the bad guy's side that like you can make it a little harder for the party to get access to their friend to bring them back, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe they kidnap the corpse because the bad guys aren't stupid. They know that they're going to bring them back, and if they know that they're going to bring them back, they're going to do everything they can to make it harder on you to revivify them.
Oh, yeah. And that goes into tactics, which is like a whole I could be here all night talking about enemy tactics. Oh my gosh, it's so exciting, and it's something that people don't delve into because it's not implicit in the monster manual or things like that. It's so cool.
Yeah, and it's like you're saying, it's really we forget, I think, about that. When all we can do is send a 200 character tweet or whatever about death in a game, a lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions about it. But just because the game lets you technically bring someone back doesn't mean that the factions at play are going to enable that to happen, right? So I think that we have to remember that when people go out there saying Revivify is broken, I don't allow it at my table, like stuff like that. Like
Oh, yeah. One thing I love about Curse of Strahd is the fact that if you come back in Barovia from death, you gain a form of madness, which is just, oh, it's delicious. It's
that's so
amazing.
cool. That's so cool. Now let's take a quick little break from the conversation and we're going to jump over to our indie showcase where we talk about Galatia. Galatia is a solo role-playing game created by Mirror Lock Atelier and written by S. Kaya J. We're going to hear from Kaya first, and then we're going to jump into a quick review of the game by myself, and then we'll come right back to today's conversation about death saves. Take it away, Kaya.
Galatea is a solo journaling TTRPG about the burden of perfectionism and trying to live up to unrealistic expectations. And to break that down a bit, we can go through that description one term at a time. It's a solo game. It's made for one player, no GMs, just you and the game book. It's a journaling game, which means your primary method of play, of interacting with the game in front of you, is to write down your thoughts in a journal or a notebook or on a document on your computer. It's a TTRPG, which means you're taking on the role of a character whose story you'll be shaping as you go. And it's about the burden of trying to live up to unrealistic expectations. This is where the magic starts happening, because this is an experience that we've all gone through, and the game becomes a vessel for the players to channel those emotions, the frustration and pain that they remembered, and the determination and the despair. And the character that they're role-playing becomes more than just a character. They become somebody that the player can project their own experience onto and work through those emotions vicariously. The premise of the game is simple. Modeled off of the Greek myth of Pygmalion and Galatea, you, the character you're playing, are a perfect masterpiece of art. You get to choose exactly what kind of art. I've seen playthroughs where the character is a statue or a painting or a doll, and I've seen playthroughs where the character is an android made to be a surrogate child, or a bioengineered superhero made by a corporation, or a generation ship. And in fact, you have been created so perfectly that you gain sentience and you come to life. Your creator is overjoyed at this perfect masterpiece that he's made, at first. As the game progresses and as you learn more about the world that you've been brought into, you have to learn how to work around your creator and his temper and his expectations, trying to figure out what makes him tick, trying to figure out how to retain his favor. Because you're trapped in his workshop, and you're dependent on him, and you're his property, and he can destroy you if he wanted to. And I think that that's a pretty familiar situation to a surprisingly large number of people, of being trapped in this terrible power imbalance and knowing that you're being judged even while you're trying to figure out what the rules you're supposed to follow are. I wrote this game in part to frame my own experiences as an immigrant and a child of strict immigrant parents, capturing that feeling of frantically trying to figure out the cultural norms inside the home and the very different cultural norms outside the home that everybody just assumed I should already know. I've seen other people play Galatea as a trans narrative, as a second generation immigrant narrative, as catharsis for their own perfectionist tendencies, and as a way to project their feelings about having changed careers and trying to keep up in their new company. The central mechanic of Galatea is the Jenga tower. Now, unlike most solo games that use a Jenga tower, and unlike the way that Jenga itself is played, in Galatea you start with a half-built tower, and you don't build full layers of Jenga blocks on top of it by default. You get told how many blocks you're putting on each layer, and sometimes you get offered a choice depending on how you react to a situation. The result is that you're intentionally building up a rickety structure that echoes how precarious your own situation is. I'm very proud of this mechanic and the way that it creates an external reflection of your character's internal state of mind. It sets up situations where your character is hesitating about how to act, whether or not they want to do the risky thing, while you're looking at the state of the tower and hesitating about whether you want to make the corresponding risky mechanical move. And the game is about risk. It's about evaluating how much risk you want to take on and mitigating the possibility of risk, and overall figuring out step by step what you want to do with your life, where you want to take it, what direction you want to go with it, and what to do if those around you don't really want to support you. Ultimately, you're going to have to make a decision, and it may not be a decision that you like. Play Galatea if you want to try out a solo journaling game, and if you want to seek a safe and private way to work through complicated feelings. Play it if you're a burned out former gifted kid who's wondering where your life went downhill. Play it if you're recovering from any kind of relationship where you felt like you always had to be what the other person needed you to be. Play it if you need a comfort character who understands exactly what you're going through. Play Galatea if you feel alone, or if you don't feel nearly alone enough. The game that I wrote won't give you any answers, but the game that you make out of it just might.
Thanks for those words about your game, Kaya. I'm really excited to talk about Galatea, and I realize now that I mispronounced it in the introduction. So it's Galatea. I'm not sure why I want to make it sound like a S with there's clearly a T there. But anyway, so like you mentioned, and for the roleplay chat audience here, this part of the show is a review. So I'm going to do a quick review of the game. I had the opportunity to play for a little under 4 hours before writing my review, and like it was previously mentioned, this is a one-player solo tabletop role-playing game, and it's also kind of a journaling game, or it is very much a journaling game, where as you play through the game, you're going to be writing down your thoughts, your emotions, and kind of creating a narrative for yourself, thanks to the prompts found in the game, in the rules, and thanks to the kind of resolution of the game as it occurs as you draw cards. One thing that I thought was really, really fun about the game was, despite the content being, it can be quite deep and can be very self-reflective, it's a lot of fun to use a Jenga tower and playing cards or tarot cards as your kind of resolution mechanic. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention, was it's a little non-traditional in that sense, in that instead of rolling dice, You're going to be drawing cards out of a traditional card deck or a tarot card deck, and then also the game will prompt you to put blocks on one of these tumbling towers, one of these Jenga towers. So that was my first thing that I wanted to mention, was that was a really cool way to add this mechanical tactile element to the game. Now, as far as my feelings when playing this solo role-playing game, I will say that as most solo journaling games, it's very self-reflective. It's very much an exploration of your emotions, your relationships. I'm a second-generation Italian Canadian, so for me, I couldn't help but think about kind of my heritage and the relationships that I have with my family, my grandparents, with Italy, in kind of the exploration of this game. And it was actually kind of surprising how deep I was able to get, how creative I was able to get while playing. So that's definitely a benefit or a boon, I think, something that I really enjoyed out of playing Galatea. There was one element of the game that I was especially fond of. Throughout the game, as you draw cards, every time you draw a queen, this creates kind of like an NPC within the game. Because the game itself is, for the most part, very focused on the relationship between you, this piece of art, this perfect piece of art, and your creator, your master, the person who constructed you. But as you play throughout the game, whenever you draw a queen out of the deck, you create kind of like this NPC. And for me, that was really fun. This NPC, I got to add an interesting new dimension to the story that was kind of happening as I was playing. And this adventure and this NPC throughout the adventure was kind of able to help me throughout my journey of self-discovery in the game, and also, in my personal growth as I played this game. Now, like I said, it took me about 4 hours, a little under 4 hours to play, one sit through, but the game is certainly replayable. I only got through about 2/3 of the deck of cards as I was playing, and then my tower came crumbling down on me, kind of signaling the end of the game. And there was a handful of scenarios and special kind of outcomes that I missed. So even if I were to play again with the exact same character and the exact same creator, I think the game would have been vastly different. So that's definitely another thing that I really enjoyed about playing Galatea. I did have two criticisms, or two things that I felt worth mentioning to the audience, though. So the first one is that this is kind of an investment emotionally, intellectually, or even just as far as like energy goes. When you're playing a game like this, you kind of get what you put into it. So if you sit down with a rainy Sunday afternoon, you got a cup of tea, a candle lit beside you, and some quiet, and really focus, and you have the creative energy within you to dedicate those 4 to 6 hours of time as you journal along, you're going to get a whole lot out of this. If you only have an hour of your time, I think you're still going to get a lot out of this, but maybe you're going to have to segment it. You might kind of forget elements of play. So you kind of have to commit a little bit, or at least I felt that way. So that's one caveat that I wanted to make sure people kind of know, that you're going to get more out of a game like this, in my opinion, if you really commit your time and energy to it. Now, I mean, I don't know if that's a criticism, really. it's more of a heads up, or a warning, I suppose, for people listening. I think that's also kind of comes with the territory. A lot of these journaling games have a tendency to be this way, where the more energy and creative juice you have at your disposal during the time of play, the more enjoyable or the more interesting the story might become. This kind of also segues into my second criticism, and I don't know if again, it's not really a criticism, it's more of a heads up, but the game really focuses on you, this piece of art, this creation, this perfect creation, and your creator. And the game really focuses a lot of its energy on this relationship. And I think that specialization is important to mention, because it does make it a little tricky sometimes to kind of craft a greater narrative surrounding your creator and you, the piece of art. Now, of course, if you're coming into this with full creative juices, full power, if you would, I think you're not gonna have a hard time coming up with this awesome environment and outside factors playing into it. But if you don't have all of your creative juices flowing, I felt like for me after kind of the second hour, I was starting to run out of things that I felt like personally were going to be interesting developments outside of the relationship. So I think one thing that could have been interesting to see in the game, or in the rules perhaps, would have been a page with the random table of scenarios, environments, perhaps deep dark secrets for your master or creator, or perhaps a, a list of outside conflicts that could be kind of pushed into the narrative, just to kind of help give you that spark plug moment to bounce off of. Now, perhaps I'm being a little overly critical because the game, like I mentioned before, really the focus and the intention here is to have that self-reflective, that self-reflection rather on yourself and the creator that made you this piece of masterful artwork or what have you. So maybe I'm going a little bit out of the lane that the game is trying to be in. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that a little bit of a push, or perhaps some tools to help you as a creator, or as a player rather, in the game might have been welcome, depending on the kind of narrative or the kind of diary entries you're writing and the kind of story you want to have surrounding your characters. But all in all, I really, really had a good time playing Galatea. Like I mentioned, it's a fantastic solo game where you really dig deep and you really think about this relationship between the creator and this piece of art. And in doing so, you will surprise yourself. I know I surprised myself in the amount of creativity that I was able to kind of pump out in this story, in the character that I was portraying, in the master who created me, and the world that surrounded us. I thought that was a lot of fun. And on a personal level, as I mentioned, as a child of somebody who immigrated to Canada, and as a father also, it really made me think about those relationships and how when one of the individuals in this relationship has perhaps a negative reaction or an emotional reaction, how it would affect the other individual in that relationship. So that was really, really neat. So thank you, Kaya, for creating this fantastic game. I had a blast of a time playing it, and it felt like a little bit of a therapy session with myself, too, to be honest. So that was kind of neat. I wasn't expecting that. And those are the most fun types of role-playing games moments, right? When you have kind of this self-reflection on yourself as the player, but also on yourself as a person. So that was kind of cool. I don't mean to get so deep here. I think you could definitely go deep with this game if you want to. So anyway, Galatea, thank you, Kaya, for providing me with a review copy of the game. If folks wanted to check it out, I definitely encourage you to do so. There's going to be a link in the show notes for today's episode where you can purchase the game, play it for yourself, and it's going to be an affiliate link. So not only will you be supporting an independent creator in purchasing Galatea, you'll also be supporting me because there'll be a small kickback that comes back to me. So anyway, thanks again, and I hope everybody goes to check out Galatea. All right, sweet. I think we now have, we've looked at other examples. We've looked at the foundational stuff. Now let's talk about like actual things people can do to modify death save rules in D&D. And you already brought up some really, really good ones, Diana, with like the rolling blind. I think that's super cool. I've also seen only the game master rolls and like doesn't even tell the person that's dying what's happening. Like I've heard of that. I haven't really digested what that would mean though for the game. How does that make you feel?
I feel like it's so here's the thing. When it comes to being a DM, one thing you have to be very careful to not do is take away player agency.
Mm.
And to some degree, it feels like it's taking away the player's control over their character, which realistically, yeah, they're dying. They're not going to have control, but not having them be able to roll the die themselves seems a little icky to me. Like, you want to make sure that they still feel like whatever happens is their responsibility or their fault. You don't want to have to take that away from them. Especially because it feels like it would so distrust. I feel like it would take a very special kind of DM to do that, and you would have to intersperse it with narrative moments, maybe flashbacks or something to give the player at least some clue as to whether or not they're actively dying. So maybe they have a flashback to like, a moment from school where their teacher, if they're a wizard, for example, is like over their shoulder trying to walk them through how to do something, and the teacher gets progressively more angry and more
Mm.
upset. That might be a sign that they're dying. Or if the teacher goes, "Oh no, it's okay, you can do it," and they have a flashback of casting the spell correctly, then maybe that means that they did well. That I feel like is tricky and unnecessarily complicated. Just let them roll the die. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I think I agree with you. Now that you like vocalize it, it feels a little icky to
Yeah.
not let the person at least roll the thing that might be the demise of their character. Yeah, I agree with you. And I really like this idea of putting in these flashbacks. And it's not really a mechanical change, right? It's just a role play change. I would even argue that maybe you should do that regardless of how you do death saves, right? Like have these moments where you have a flashback. Maybe you ask the character or the player, you just succeeded your death save. Let's think of like a happy memory that floods you right now as you're lying on the ground in the battlefield. And you kind of let that person actively participate in the game because otherwise I feel kind of bad for the person that's down. Everyone else is
Yeah.
casting cool spells, moving around the battlefield, doing something like a little bit more dramatic, and they're just kind of on the ground. Um,
Yeah. Depending on the tone of the campaign and the role playing ability of the character, if they succeed, you can sit there and be like, what's giving you hope in this moment? Like,
mhm.
what are you drawing strength from right now? Or if they fail, it's like, what's giving you dread? What are you afraid of? Why, how do you feel right now knowing that you're dying? Like, as if it's a certainty. You know you're dying. How does that impact you?
Yeah.
Which I wouldn't recommend for like new players to throw that on them because people who are new to TTRPGs might not feel super confident in that sort of thing. But that's why our role as a DM is to ease them into little role play moments and ask them those questions.
Yeah, yeah, and it doesn't have to be something too heavy either. I really like how you asked like what's somebody or something that gives you hope. They don't really even have to role play. They could just be like my party gives me hope. And then
Mhm.
just them saying that kind of like helps bond the party together in this like special way that only really having a character dying can do, I think. But
Yeah.
because they vocalized it out loud, it adds that little secret sauce, to everything. I did something
Mhm.
like that. When was it? It was in the same home game, and I kind of asked these kinds of questions to some of my players. And granted, they've been playing now at my table for almost a year and a half, but this was the first time I think that they've really joined like a long-standing Dungeons and Dragons game. So
Nice.
I wouldn't necessarily call them heavy role players, but like they like the idea of it. And every now and then they have these really like these moments of inspiration. And you ask them one of these questions, they might come up with something truly shocking about the back of their character that never would have come out otherwise. I agree with you wholeheartedly that you don't want to put pressure on new players. I think sometimes throwing them an opportunity to showcase it if they want to, it's really good, right? So it's like finding that balance of like not pushing them too hard, asking them like a softball question that they could go into the deep end with if they wanted to. Um, this is a good opportunity to do that, I think.
Oh, 100%. I
Yeah.
think one of the end like takeaways here is whether or not someone survives or doesn't survive a death saving throw experience, the party should come out changed in
Mm,
some way narratively.
very concise. I love it. That's really cool.
Thank you. I took high school English classes for entirely too long.
All right, sweet. Let's look at a couple other ones on this list. So here, let's go to this one. The last stand rules. You talked about going down in a blaze of glory in Dread.
Mm.
Matt Colville actually came up with a series of rules called that he calls the last stand rules that I've never used, but they seem really cool. And a lot of people made variations on it. But basically what it is it's your character choosing to die. Like instead of rolling death saves, instead of doing anything, you kind of just stand up, you hold the door, and you brace for impact. And in exchange, you allow your party to flee, or you allow somebody else to be healed, and you go down, and your character dies, and there's no coming back. So there was a lot of there's not excuse me there's a lot of variations to this where like it gets super crunchy. We're like, oh, you know what? You get temporary hit points, and you can fight until you lose all your temporary hit points, at which point you die, like you're done. Or you gain extra spell slots and 1 HP, and you can kind of like go ham, and then presumably you die and then don't come back. Stuff like that. But how do you feel about that? Does
I
that sound like it would be fun to implement?
Dude, I've never heard this before. And I don't know how I haven't heard of it before, but this sounds awesome. I would 100% implement that into a campaign because, like, at the end of the day, everyone's here to be a hero. Giving them a mechanical, and granted, I love the crunch of the game, even though I'm not big on balancing and things like that. I love
Mm,
numbers and being able to say, like, okay, here's a rule that we can follow. Here's the exact number of HP that you get. Here's the exact, like, amount of extra spell slots or whatever. Um, I love that. I think that's fantastic, and it's a really good way to it's it's one of those things where the player and the character are both very aware that the end is coming,
hmm
and you have an opportunity to make it good as opposed to just lying on the ground bleeding out helpless. I think that's fantastic. I might adopt that.
Yeah, cool. Do it. I'd love to hear how it works out. And I think, I mean, I don't know the granularity of it, but I'm of the impression that this isn't like a do or die thing. Like you can choose not to take a last stand, right? So in a case where a character thinks that the death saves is the appropriate thing to do, they just roll the death saves. But in a situation where they think that they can have a big enough impact to have that heroic moment, maybe they take a last stand. So it's just giving people more options too, right? Which is never a bad
Mm,
thing, I don't think.
100%. That is so
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, yeah. Um, Sweet. So I think that that was one of my favorites of the list, but there's a couple of other ones. There was one, and now I'm gonna forget who said it. I'm gonna try to figure out who said it and include it in the show notes. But there was one rule where you can allow a player when they would otherwise have hit 0 HP to kind of stop at 1 and sacrifice a piece of their equipment in exchange to like illustrate their magic sword taking the brunt of the damage, or their shield, or their armor. So here the character is sacrificing potentially something that they worked really hard to acquire in the game in exchange for going down. Um, you could also
Mhm.
probably modify that to make it happen like during the death save, like rolling. I'm not exactly sure how that would work out, but I think that's an interesting option too. What do you think of that, Diana?
I'm not a huge fan of the fact that you could buy your way out of death
Mm,
unless it comes with something extra, like, maybe a demon or a devil that corresponds to whichever archdevil, I forget them off the top of my head because I'm a bad DM, is the one that like governs wealth and material goods and things like that. Maybe someone shows up and offers a contract deal and there's a narrative reason for it.
very cool.
But in game, like, I don't know, if you're getting shot with magic missiles, right? I don't know how holding up, your shield would necessarily, especially when it comes to magic items, they're
Hmm.
by definition, like, almost impervious to most types of damage, I'm pretty sure, or they're, like, resistant to every type of damage by default. I think there's, like, this disconnect in my head where I'm like, "That doesn't make sense, that's not realistic," and that's
Yeah,
what gets me.
that's fine. I think that's a really valid opinion. I I think for me, the reason why I think it's kind of neat is I play in like a low magic setting. So I like you
Oh.
can't buy a magic shield at a store. It's not something like my party has to go and like find it in the bottom of a cave somewhere, and kill a lich to get something cool. Um, but I think it probably is very dependent, like you're saying, on the availability of these items.
That
You can't
makes a
just
lot
have
more
them
sense.
like break your helmet that isn't valuable to them. Like there's got to be like a narrative impact to this character sacrificing the sword that they gave a name to and that they've, cherished their whole life. So yeah, okay. I think there's a balance there.
Yeah.
Mileage may vary.
I'm coming at it from, like, a default D&D attitude
Yeah.
perspective too. Like, if you talk about to your players in session 0 and they're like, "I really wanna be able to buy my way out of death because I don't like the concept, like, I'm terrified to die," then yes, of course, that's a fantastic rule to make it a little bit easier on them. One of those caveats, it depends on how you play.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Let's see. There's a few other rules that allow you to kind of trade exhaustion points, actions while you're down. So you get to 0 hit points, you fall. You still have to roll a death save, yay or nay. But instead of that being the only thing you can do, you can spend, I think it's like 3 exhaustion points to take an action, or 2 exhaustion points to make a movement where you crawl, or 1 exhaustion point to take a bonus action. And you can't take all 3. It's like one or the other. Uh, but here it's kind of like you're toying with this idea of having these other consequences for being maybe mobile to get out of the way from an attack or whatnot. So how do you feel about adding that little extra crunch?
Interesting. I mean, in 5e, right, in the current release as of this recording, that is punishing. Exhaustion as a
Mm-hmm.
mechanic is punishing as hell. Like, even taking 2 exhaustion points, you're gonna be functionally at a lower capability to do almost everything for 2 days, because
Yeah.
you don't reduce exhaustion points except by long rest and then some smaller other mechanics that are less common. Um, by the time this comes out, we'll be able to talk about the 2024 Player's Handbook, though, which has some new rules for exhaustion. And
Interesting.
those are a lot less punishing, more scalable. I think this rule makes more sense in the 2024 version. But again, I'm not a mechanics girly, I'm not a balance girly. I think it'd be interesting to see, and I want to see more people play with that and see what their experiences are, because I'm nothing if not a sheep. And so whatever other people say, I will 100% go with. Um, but I kind of want to see that play tested in the new version.
Um, cool. And then maybe there's one last one that I wanted to talk about before we just kind of get into like our general advice. But the last one is making death saves a con save instead of just a flat coin flip.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you have opinions about this right away. Do you have something to say right now? Because I don't want to influence your opinion if you do.
Right away, I'm a little worried about how it would affect different classes. Like,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, your tank is gonna stay tanky, but maybe that's by design. But also, that would have to kind of work. You'd have to consider effects on magic items that offer changes to death saving throws, and then subclasses and things like that that offer changes to death saving throws to make
Mm.
sure it's still balanced when it comes to like, God, there's like some amulet that gives you advantage on death saving throws, for example. It's like, would you then
Oh,
just get
cool.
advantage on con saves? Like, you would kind of have to tweak things a little. It would take more consideration than a single sentence, like it's presented
Definitely.
here would need. But I don't know. What you had further thoughts that might sway my opinion? I'm looking to be
Well,
swayed.
yeah, I mean, I didn't think of all that, like the magic items and stuff, and that's a really interesting point. But if we say that maybe a death save allows you to add your constitution modifier, perhaps instead of just saying it's a con save, I think it's kind of like thematically appropriate. A barbarian or a fighter who might have a high constitution is probably harder to kill, than a wizard who doesn't. And it might encourage people who are those frontliners to take more risks, I think. Because otherwise, if all apples are apples and everybody has the same like probability of dying, the person who's holding the line might not want to because they're afraid of falling down and being done.
Mhm.
This kind of gives them this like little bit of reassurance that like, look, you're good at coming back on your feet. You have this because it's something that you're trained in. But I hadn't considered like all the magic items and the deeper balance implications of like maybe this makes Constitution a much better score than everything else that I don't know.
I mean, maybe. It's probably easy to tweak accordingly, but you're super right. Like, that means we wouldn't have to pull back as much as DMs, which is always nice.
Yeah.
You can just like hammer on the fighter because you're like, come on, we know you can get up, you're fine. And then kind of, it would change the dynamics of combat, really. It would change combat strategies on a level that I'm not entirely sure I can foresee right away, but it's interesting. I kind of
Hmm.
want to see it in action.
Yeah, I would be fun to try. It'd be fun to try. And I don't feel like it's that punishing. People don't usually dump con anyway. Like usually they're gonna
Uh,
dump like int. Do they? I don't know.
I dump con like every time. I know I'm not supposed to. I'm a druid main. I'm supposed to have con as like my top stat. I'm not
Yeah,
good.
that's gotta be
Not a
up
good
there, doesn't it?
druid main. It's supposed to be.
Are you like the druid in the back casting spells and being like a bird or something? Is that
I yes, and also I'm like God, my main druid character, my favorite ever was like wisdom first and then charisma. She was like a former
cool?
tradesperson, and so she was like the party face for all these sorts of scenarios, and you wouldn't expect she was a very bougie druid. She wasn't all like sticks in her hair, dirty clothes, things like that. She wore jewelry and all that. My favorite character ever.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. That's a lot of fun. Are you still playing her?
I wish. I've tried to bring her into 2 different campaigns and both have fizzled out.
Oh
I miss her
no.
every day. There's a picture of her. I got art commissioned. It's up on my Instagram if anyone's curious. My first ever D&D character. I love her to death.
That's always a shame when
I
they just
know.
don't find the right party to be in. I'm
I'll
sure
keep
one
trying.
day. I'm sure
Yeah,
one day.
not giving up.
Awesome. Well, that covers all of the kinds of things that I was able to do research on. But I'd love to hear, Diana, if there are modifications or alterations or even just strategies that you might suggest to a game master to kind of spice up death saves or to make them feel more impactful in the game, as far as your experience goes and like suggestions that you might have.
Yeah. I mean, beyond the biggest thing that I advocate for being the rule that we talked about earlier, where the DM and the player should go behind the DM screen together and the player should roll in front of the DM and not tell anyone what the result is. Got to work on your poker face a little bit for that one, but I highly recommend it as far as preventing metagaming goes. Another thing that I recommend, especially for new DMs, is when your players sit down with you for their first couple sessions and they've developed a character, even for session zero, be sure that one of the questions you ask them about their character and their character's background is, hey, give me some core memories that like full on narrative moments, not just like,
Hmm.
oh, my character went to, a school of magic for 3 years. Like, what is a core memory from your time at school that you would remember? Like, give me a vignette, give me a scene, and have them give you like a list. It can be short, like maybe 3 or 4 vignettes, moments from their childhood. And when they go down during death saving throws, those can be what you pull from in those narrative moments. Right before or right
Super
after
cool.
they roll, you just narrate that back to them. It doesn't have to be word for word, you can embellish a little bit, but especially as a beginner DM, that means they've given you the story and they don't know that you're going to pull call back to it when they're dying on the ground and bleeding out. But it's a very good, easy way to provide some narrative spice to the game.
That's awesome. And like if they're giving this to you, it's obviously important to them. So
Yeah,
giving this the opportunity to have airtime at the table, I think is super clever because it's like a win-win. They're happy that it's coming out. The rest of the table is probably super invested in hearing it because it's like something that's been thought out with proper thought, like for the player to write it out is a core memory. So
yeah.
it's kind of like you're saying, this vignette moment, this opportunity to like shine spotlight on the character even though they're down and they don't have a whole lot going on. I really like that a
Oh
lot.
yeah. And it evolves with you as you go, as you get more experience as a DM and as your players get more experience as role players. You don't have to have them. They might, without even realizing it, as part of their backstory, start giving you these little vignettes that you can pluck out yourself without telling them or asking them for it. Or maybe you can just in the moment ask them, like, hey, what are you thinking about? Like we talked about earlier. And once they get better at role playing, they'll be able to improvise that sort of stuff and dynamically change the scene and kind of have like this two-person one-on-one role play moment that just takes up a couple seconds, 6 seconds in the real world. So it's something that pushes your players to consider their character's development deeper, their character's backstory and how it relates to who they are today a little bit deeper, and it gets them more into role playing, especially when they're just starting out. So it's a very good tool.
Mhm. Yeah, super cool. I really like that a lot. And I think part of the reason I like it too is because it's bringing narration to, like you were saying earlier, something that's so mechanically detailed in the book and there's no like
Yeah.
insight on how
Yep.
to make it
Gotcha.
right. And it's supposed to be this like super climactic moment. A character dying is probably the highest like the highest drama you could achieve outside of like some crazy betrayal by an NPC or like
Hmm.
you know what I mean? Like it's up there as like the top dramatic moments, the most memorable moments of a game. But if you don't inject the narrative, it can fall flat. So I really appreciate you making that suggestion. Yeah, completely. And it kind of ties into kind of advice that I might have for people playing also is that try to think of the narrative consequences of death as opposed to just the mechanical consequences of death, right? Having a character fall in combat is detrimental because now there's one less character able to inflict damage on the enemies. But if that's the only way you portray it as a game master, it's not going to be as exciting for everybody involved. You have to make this a really big moment for the baddies too. They just downed a hero. They're probably like super pumped up. Maybe they're getting a little arrogant. Maybe they're saying stuff to the other party members. Maybe they start bargaining to try and be like, hey, if you want to get out of here alive, you come up with some kind of excuse, kind of like the hag in my earlier example. You can kind of come up with bargains. Um, or it doesn't have to be bargains with like allowing the players to escape. Maybe they like want to take something away from the party. Maybe they want power from the party. Maybe they want to be able to, if you're playing like a very politically intrigue heavy game, they want a seat they want a seat on like the Duke's Council, or they want a mole in some kind of like academic setting. You can
Ooh.
make that failure of death become narrative by having like consequences that kind of bleed into the rest of your game outside of just, oh, now we have one less attack or two less attacks this round, you know?
Yeah. Continuity and the butterfly effect. Those are your bread and butter as a DM. Once you get more into GMing and you get more experience, that's the kind of stuff that you want to focus on to have just like really easy but really hard-hitting narrative moments. What happens to the the family of that adventurer? Is the rest of the party then going to go tell them what happened, deliver the bad news? Do they have a body to take back? How are they going to take it?
Mhm.
Maybe that's like I almost want to say a beach episode, but not as fun. Just like a little break in the plot that's horrifically sad, but also really important. And not
Yeah,
combat focused, but just RP focused?
that's super interesting. It reminds me a little bit of a conversation I had with Shannon and Sean from the Paradise Production Company a long time ago now. I think it was like 2 years ago. We talked about this philosophy that Sean has about character death. And I won't get too into it, but basically, one of the things that he said in that conversation was that a character death is in fact more impactful if and when their story isn't finished being told, which I think is a hot take, but for it to be interesting, the rest of the party needs to know that character's objectives. We need to know what that character was trying to do. Because if that character dies, the rest of the party could potentially finish the quest for that. Maybe there's a sword that the character wanted to bring to the grave of their friend, and now they're dead. But now the
Mhm.
party can bring the sword with them to that location and have like this second moment of remembering that character and allowing that quest to be completed. So
Yeah.
I think if I were to have some advice for maybe players listening, if you do find yourself in a situation where you think your character might die or you're going into a really big fight, don't forget to seed your own character's objectives to the rest of the party and to the game master. Because even if you don't get to them, maybe they'll be able to finish them for you, and it's super satisfying. And that's never happened
Oh
to
yeah.
me. It's never like actually, I've never actually achieved that in a game, but one of these days, one of these days.
One of these days someone's gonna die and we'll make it fun.
Exactly. Awesome. Maybe one last question for you, Diana, before we
Yeah.
before we close up. Speaking of new game masters,
Mhm.
what would you have to say to a game master who is face to face with a scenario where maybe they're going to kill a character right now? What
Ooh.
would you, because I think we talked about a lot of high level stuff that maybe in practice might be hard to do kind of on your first go at this. What would be like the first step for someone to take in this kind of scenario?
I mean, ideally, that kind of scenario would be something that you're prepared for based off your session ones and session
Mm.
zeros, where you've talked to your players, you've discussed the possibility of death and cleared it with them first and checked to see, like, hey, are you okay with death? Do you want this to be a death-free campaign where there's always an ex machina, a way out? Do you want there to be death, like, unlocked as an option after level, 5 or whatever, when you're less squishy, And so hopefully you know what to do in this scenario. You know what your players want. But if you haven't had the chance to prepare that, you weren't familiar with session zeros when you started GMing, something like that. First of all, it's never too late to have a session zero. It doesn't have to be sequentially first. You can always go back in and double check things, amend things that you've said before. Do not be afraid to do that. It makes a better game for everyone. But if you get to the point where you're like actually in that moment, read the room. If you can see that your player your player's about to cry or something, pull back the reins a little bit. No one's gonna blame you for that. You're in full control here, and you are holding this character's death in your hands. Make sure you do it, whatever you do. Make sure it's something that the player's okay with, that is narratively satisfying. Read the room. Is the best
100%.
advice I can give. I mean, you're in full control. If you want to bail them out, you can bail them out if you feel like that's the best thing to do to keep the story going.
Yeah,
It's
I
your game.
couldn't agree more. Like session zeros, 1,000,000%. Have them all the time.
Hmm.
But sometimes you ask somebody if they're okay with something out of context and they say yes. And then in context, what is happening, their face is telling you something completely different. So don't just hide behind the game master screen and make your decisions. Look at what's going on because odds are there's a lot of emotions happening and maybe they don't want their character down
Hmm.
for good. At least not right now. So like you said, bail them out if that's what has to happen. Um, yeah,
I
sweet.
will say personally, I am 100% the type of player who's like, if you need to kill me for the bit, do it. Like full on, I will fall on a sword for a good narrative story. I will have 20 backup characters, one DM to another whenever I'm a player in a campaign. I'm like, listen, I know what it's like to be on that side of the DM screen. If you want to do it for the story, full permission. You have my blessing. So, but not everyone's like that.
I mean, that's a really interesting thing to do too. Like you send them a text. You like like don't let the rest of the table know that that's happening. But just text them. Be like, or even if you're the one behind the screen, it takes a while, right? Going around the table. When the character goes down to 0 hit points the first time, you could send them a message real quick. Be like, hey, you ready to die tonight or not? Like, like don't have to say
Yeah,
it like
no one
that, but
has to
like
know.
no one has to know that that conversation is happening. And if they say no, you trust their judgment and you don't do it. Or maybe they say yes and like you said, it's okay, yeah, I'm ready to fall on the sword. Let's make something cool happen. And then you can have that little secret meeting. I mean, you
Very
could
good
even
tip.
do it in person, I think. Like you could pull them off to the corner and have a quick little chat.
Oh
I
yeah.
don't think it's too conspicuous, but
Mm-mm. If anything, like even if you want to cover it up, just be like, yeah, we talked about what they see when they die and it's confidential to them. It's part of their backstory they don't want to reveal yet, blah blah blah. Make something up. Dude, as a
mhm.
DM, I lie to my players all the time. I will full on admit that because it's for the bit. It's for the narrative. So
Yeah,
yeah.
well done. Well done. All right. So now, before we wrap the show up, we're gonna go into the secret club or the not so secret role play chat club, and we're gonna chat a little bit about game prep and game prep as it pertains to character death. So for everybody who's a Patreon subscriber, we'll see you in there, and everybody else, we'll see you in a little bit. Hello again, listeners of Roleplay Chat. We're now at the end of the episode. So, Diana, I'm going to pass you the microphone to kind of share any last thoughts or parting words that you might have as it pertains to character death and death saves in Dungeons and Dragons. And then once you've said that, please also remind us where we can come and find you in the world of social media and any kind of projects you might have going on that you're super excited about and eager to get eyes on.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to death saving throws, in the end, ask your party what they want out of their final moments. Do it during session 0, do it in the moment. Make sure that even if their story ends here, they should walk away still feeling fulfilled with how it ended. And then when it comes to things like adjusted mechanics, just toy around, see what you like, gather opinions from Reddit or whatever. You don't have to stick with what's in the book. Homebrew is such a big part of D&D, so if you feel like the death saving throw mechanics as they aren't working for you, that's totally fine. I can't think of a single person who runs D&D just as written from the book 100% of the way through. So please mess with the rules as you feel it's appropriate for your game, for the tone of your game, for the story, for the plot, for the fun of it. Have fun. Do what you need to do. As far as me, I'm Diana Faye. I am known as Diana of the Rose on all platforms, just at Diana of the Rose. I am a TTRPG content creator, and I do stuff like this all the time, specifically giving people advice on how they can level up their game as a dungeon master or a game master. Even if you're brand new to it, if you're just like toying with the idea of being a GM for the first time and you're like, oh my God, I can never live up to Matt Mercer or Brendan Lee Mulligan. I make it easy for you, I promise. So come check it out. I also stream 3 times a week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, starting at 5 o'clock Pacific time over on my Twitch channel. That tends to be where I can answer questions in the fastest way possible, but also feel free to leave comments, attend panels. I'm going to be at all 3 of the PAXs and Gen Con pretty much every year, so keep an eye out for my name on the events rosters, and beyond that, I'll be around.
Awesome. Yeah, and for those of you who might have a hard time remembering anything, because it's me, Diana's information will all be linked in the show notes, or if you're listening on YouTube, in the like gobbledygook in the comment, just above the comments. So you can find all of that linked up there. If you wanted to reach out to me, you know how to do that. That's contact@roleplaychat@gmail.com. Or if you rather subject yourself to a character limit, you can find me at roll_play_chat on all socials. Thanks again, Diana. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about death saves.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Talk to you later. Bye now, and let's call it a chat. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of today's episode, friends. If you made it all the way here, you are one of the true MVPs of the Roleplay Chat audience. The other MVPs of the Roleplay Chat audience are the Patreon subscribers who are supporting me through their subscription on Patreon. I'd like to thank Domil's Wondrous Works and Jason over at Shadowmane. Thanks to the 2 of you for supporting me. Your support allows me to continue to make this show. If you wanted to join them, you're welcome to do so by going onto Patreon and looking for Roleplay Chat. There's also a link down in the show notes. There you can subscribe to the show, where you can get access to the episodes as soon as they're done, as well as extended episodes depending on the tier that you subscribe to. You can also support the show without spending money. You can do that by reviewing the show, spreading the good word, and sharing the show with your friends. If you do that, it really helps to broaden the reach of Roleplay Chat. Recommendations, personal recommendations, and word of mouth really are one of the number 1 ways for the podcast to be discovered. Also, if you're looking to buy some new tabletop RPG stuff, like dice, miniatures, or new games and rules and supplements, the show notes have links to affiliate links. So if you were to buy things using those affiliate links, for instance, the indie showcase that was spotlighted in today's episode, you can purchase it there, sometimes at a discount too, depending on the link, and a small kickback comes back to me. Thanks again for making it all the way here, and one last thank you to Alex and Chase over at Pocket Bard for allowing me to use their music for the intro and outro of Roleplay Chat.